She had dirt under her fingernails and a hole in her left boot. He had 3,000 acres, a cattle empire, and his choice of every wealthy widow from here to the Missouri River. The whole valley laughed when Garrett Kane walked past the silk dresses and the silver-tongued promises and stopped in front of her. They said he'd lost his mind. They said she'd tricked him. They said it wouldn't last a season. What they didn't say, what none of them could have known standing there in their fine clothes with their clean hands, was that she was the only thing standing between all of them and total ruin. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Garrett Kane rode into Blackthorn Ridge after 3 weeks on the northern range, he came back to find a new problem waiting for him. And the problem was wearing a blue dress and standing on his porch. Her name was Constance Aldrich. She was the widow of Howard Aldrich, who had owned the Aldrich timber operation east of the ridge until his heart gave out 2 summers prior. Howard had been 61. Constance was 34. She had a way of tilting her chin upward that made it clear she believed the angle was flattering, and she carried a covered dish in both hands like she was delivering something sacred. Garrett didn't slow his horse when he saw her. He rode it all the way to the fence post, dismounted there, and began unsaddling without a word. "Mr. Kane," Constance descended the porch steps with practiced elegance. "I brought a venison roast. Mrs. Darby prepared it this morning. She uses juniper berries. It's quite something." "I appreciate that," Garrett said, looping the reins around the post. He was 41, broad through the shoulder, with a face that had spent too many seasons in the sun to be called handsome in any gentle sense. He looked like a man who had earned every year he carried. "You can leave it on the step." A flicker crossed Constance's face. Not quite irritation, not quite hurt, but something between the two. "I hoped we might talk. There's a matter of the Eastern water rights, but my late husband held partial interest, as you know, and I believe a conversation between neighbors would be, my lawyer handles the water rights." "Of course." She adjusted the dish in her hands. "Of course he does. But some conversations are better had in person. Over a meal, perhaps." Garrett pulled the saddle free and turned toward the barn. "I'm sure that's true, Mrs. Aldrich. I'll have someone return the dish." He walked away without looking back. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't anything personal. He just didn't have the patience for it, and everyone in Blackthorn Ridge had come to understand that about him. Some people accepted it. Most found it infuriating. The town had been trying to marry Garrett Kane off for 7 years. Blackthorn Ridge sat in a long valley between 2 ridges of broken granite, the kind of landscape that rewarded stubbornness and punished sentimentality. The settlement had grown up around a river crossing and a trading post, and it had survived drought years and harsh winters, and the kind of lawlessness that arrived when you were 2 hard days' ride from the nearest territorial marshal. What it had now, in the spring of that year, was something that passed for stability, and at the center of that stability sat the Kane Ranch, 3,000 and some acres. A main house that had taken 4 years to build properly, a bunkhouse that slept 18 hands, a hay barn that could hold more than any other operation in the valley, and a cattle herd that numbered close to 1,200 head. What Garrett had built wasn't luck, and it wasn't inheritance. His father had left him 60 acres of rocky hillside and a broken promise. It was 15 years of grinding, relentless work, and a mind that was better with numbers and weather patterns and livestock cycles than it had any right to be, which was why the widows came. Every season brought new ones. They arrived from the eastern settlements and sometimes from as far as Denver, women who had money and land and the practical understanding that a man like Garrett Kane could double what they had in 10 years. They came with roasts and with lawyers, with flattery and with acreage surveys. They sat in the parlors of Blackthorn Ridge's better homes, and they talked about legacy and partnership and the wisdom of not building something alone. Garrett listened to all of it and agreed with none of it. It wasn't that he was opposed to marriage on principle. It was that he had watched his mother marry a man for security and spend 30 years becoming furniture in her own house. And somewhere in that observation, he had formed a very specific idea of the kind of woman he could actually live alongside. And none of the women arriving in blue silk dresses with covered dishes were it. He knew what he was looking for. He just hadn't said it to anyone. He wasn't the kind of man who explained himself. He saw Mara Quinn for the first time in April, though she had apparently been in the valley for nearly a year before that. He'd ridden out to check on the Harlan property, a small cattle operation, maybe 200 acres, run by a family that had been struggling since the father, Tom Harlan, broke his leg the previous autumn and couldn't work a full season. Word was they were close to giving the land back to the bank. Garrett had no particular interest in acquiring it, but he had some interest in knowing whether they would, because the property sat adjacent to his northern fence line, and he preferred to know who his neighbors were going to be. What he found when he rode up wasn't what he expected. Two figures were in the east pasture, working a fence line that had partially collapsed. One was a boy. Couldn't have been older than 14, probably Tom Harlan's youngest, and the other was a young woman, maybe 23 or 24, working a post driver with both arms like she'd been doing it her whole life. She had dark hair pulled back without much care, work clothes that were clean but old, and she was driving fence posts with a rhythm that most ranch hands would have respected. Garrett slowed his horse and watched for a moment. She didn't notice him. The boy said something, and she replied without stopping. Drove the post 3 more times, tested it with her weight, then moved to the next position. Her hands, when she grabbed the post to test it, were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life indoors. He rode on, but he noted it. He found out who she was from his foreman, a weathered Texan named Ellis, who had been with the cane operation for 9 years, and who knew everything that happened in the valley before Garrett did. "Quinn girl," Ellis said when Garrett asked that evening. "Mara Quinn. Came in last spring, hired herself to the Harlans when Tom broke his leg. She's been working the place since September. Fence repair, livestock, hay cutting. Does the work of 1.5 men, from what I hear." "Where's she from?" "South somewhere. Lost her people. I don't know the details. She doesn't talk about it much." Ellis paused, then added because he was a careful man. "She's not from money, if that's what you're asking." "That's not what I'm asking." Ellis looked at him for a moment. "She boards at the Harlan house. Doesn't come into town much. Keeps to herself mostly." Garrett said nothing more about it. But 2 weeks later, he found a reason to ride back past the Harlan property. The second time he saw her, she was in an argument, not with a person, with a calf. One of the Harlan's heifers had apparently managed to get her leg tangled in the remnants of the old fence line, and the animal was down on her side in a half-panic, while Mara knelt in the mud beside her, talking in a low voice while trying to work the wire free with a pair of fence pliers. The calf was fighting her. Mara had already been kicked once, judging by the fresh mud on her sleeve and the way she was holding her left arm, slightly different from her right. Garrett dismounted without thinking much about it. He came up on the calf's other side, got his hands on the animal's shoulder to hold her still, and nodded at Mara. She looked up. She had gray eyes, not blue, not green, gray, and they were currently full of a very practical calculation about whether his help was going to be useful or whether it was going to make things worse. "Hold her steady," Mara said, apparently deciding he'd do. "Don't let her roll." He held her. Mara worked the pliers. The wire came free in about 4 minutes, and the calf scrambled to her feet and bolted 20 yards before stopping to look back at them with the expression animals have when they're embarrassed. Mara stood, wiped her hands on her trousers, and examined the cut on the calf's leg from a distance. "She'll be fine," Garrett said. "I know she'll be fine." Mara looked at him for a moment. "You're Kane." "I am." "Your fence line's north of here." "I know where my fence line is." A pause. She wasn't unfriendly, exactly. She just wasn't performing anything. There was no particular warmth in her expression, but no hostility either. Just a woman assessing a situation with the same practical attention she'd applied to the tangled wire. "Thank you for the help," she said, and then turned and walked toward the barn. He stood there for a moment watching her go. Then he got back on his horse. He rode back to his own property thinking about the way she'd looked at him. Not with curiosity about his money or his land or his position in the valley, but just the plain look of someone deciding whether another person was going to be useful in a particular situation. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him that way. The spring social was a tradition in Blackthorn Ridge, a gathering at the Merchants' Hall at the end of May, when the worst of the mud had dried and people were willing to leave their properties for an evening. It was the social event of the season, such as it was, and it was the occasion at which the valley's eligible women made their most concentrated effort in Garrett Kane's direction. This year's effort was impressive. Constance Aldrich arrived in a green dress that had clearly come from somewhere east of Blackthorn Ridge and cost more than most ranch hands made in 2 months. She was accompanied by another widow, a woman named Helena Forsyth, whose husband had owned the Forsyth grain operation before dying of pneumonia, and who had the particular quality of never entering a room without making sure everyone in it noticed. The two of them positioned themselves near the entrance and took turns engaging Garrett in conversation that was organized beneath its pleasant surface, like a military campaign. Garrett was polite. He was always polite. He just wasn't interested, and his politeness had a flatness to it that women like Constance and Helena found maddening because it gave them nothing to work with. Mara Quinn was not supposed to be at the social. Nobody had told her that specifically. It wasn't written anywhere. But the social was understood to be for the community's settled families, for the merchants and the landowners and their households. And Mara Quinn was a hired worker with no land and no family name and no real claim to the category of people the social was for. She came because young Tom Harlan, the boy, not his father, had asked her to come, and because she'd been in the valley almost a year and had never been to anything social, and because she owned exactly one dress that was presentable, and she thought she might as well use it. The dress was gray-blue, simple, nothing like what Constance Aldrich was wearing. She stood near the edge of the room with Tom Jr. and one of the Harlan daughters, and she listened to the music and watched the dancing with the quiet attention she brought to most things. Garrett saw her from across the room and felt something shift in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not desire, exactly. It wasn't that simple, but a kind of recognition. The way she stood, slightly apart from everything, watching without performing, with those gray eyes that missed nothing. He crossed the room. He was aware that Constance and Helena tracked him with their eyes as he moved. He stopped beside Mara. "Miss Quinn?" She looked at him, mildly surprised. "Mr. Kane, are you enjoying the evening?" "I'm enjoying the fiddle player," she said. "He's good." "He is." Garrett glanced at the musicians. "Came up from Cheyenne last fall. Works as a farrier the rest of the year." "Good hands, then?" "Presumably." A pause. Not an uncomfortable one. She was watching the room with that same quality of attention, and he found himself standing there in no particular hurry to say anything else. "How's the Harlan heifer?" he asked. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. Not quite a smile, but a softening of the precision she usually held her face in. "Walking fine, you'd never know." "Good." They stood there for another moment. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. She turned to look at him fully, that same gray-eyed assessment. "I'm not a very good dancer." "That makes two of us." Another moment. "All right," she said. They danced once. It was a simple enough reel, not demanding. And they danced without much grace, but without stepping on each other either. And when it was over, she thanked him simply and stepped back to where she'd been standing. That was all. It lasted maybe 4 minutes. But Constance Aldrich had seen it, and Helena Forsyth had seen it, and the merchant's wife had seen it. And by morning, half of Blackthorn Ridge had heard that Garrett Kane had crossed a full room of eligible women to dance with a penniless laborer girl who boarded with the Harlans, and the other half heard by noon. The laughing started quietly. Then it got louder. It didn't happen fast. Nothing real ever does. Through May and into June, Garrett found reasons to ride past the Harlan place. It wasn't every day. He had a ranch to run, and he wasn't the kind of man who made himself conspicuous. But it was regular enough. He would stop and talk to Tom Harlan Sr., who was back on his feet now but still moving carefully. And while he talked to Tom, Mara would often be within earshot, working at something. She didn't seek him out. She didn't try to position herself in his view. She just worked, and occasionally they would exchange a few words. And occasionally those words would turn into an actual conversation. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learn things about a person who doesn't volunteer much. She was from a small settlement in the south of the territory. Her father had tried to run cattle there and failed, first from weather and then from debt, and had died of something lung-related when she was 17, leaving her with no land and no brothers and a mother who followed him 2 years later. She had worked her way north over the course of a few years, doing whatever work was available: cattle, crops, fence repair. One winter helping a doctor's household while the doctor's wife was sick. She had no illusions about the frontier and no particular bitterness about it either. She was just someone who had learned to solve problems because there had never been anyone else to solve them for her. She was also, Garrett discovered, considerably more intelligent than most people in the valley assumed. She understood cattle the way you understood them when you'd worked them for years, not from books, but from observation. She knew weather patterns. She had opinions about water management and grazing rotation that were more sophisticated than most ranchers twice her age, and she held those opinions without needing anyone to validate them. What she didn't have was any patience for pretense. She was not cutting about it. She wasn't cruel. But there was something in her that simply couldn't produce the social performances that Blackthorn Ridge ran on, the careful management of impressions, the calibrated flattery, and the strategic deference. She said what she observed. She asked what she needed to know. She was quiet when she had nothing to say. Garrett Kane, who had spent 7 years watching people perform at him, found this nearly devastating. By July, he was making no real secret of his interest. He brought his business to the Harlan place under pretexts that were increasingly transparent, and he had begun the process of actually courting Mara Quinn in the blunt, uncomfortable way of a man who had never been very good at the social forms of such things. This was when the trouble started. "I heard something today," said Ellis, setting a tin cup on Garrett's desk one morning without being invited to sit down, which meant it was something he thought was important. "From Whitley, at the feed store." Garrett looked up from the ledger. "What did Whitley say?" "He said the Aldrich woman and the Forsyth woman had coffee at the Merchants' Hall yesterday, and they were talking about the Quinn girl." Ellis paused. "Not kindly." "What were they saying?" "That she's made herself a nuisance. That she's got her hooks in you because she's after your land." Ellis delivered this without editorial comment, because Ellis was a man who delivered information and let other people do the editorializing. "They also said," he stopped. "Ellis, they said she's not right. In the head. That a woman her age with nothing to her name, who works like a field hand and doesn't make herself presentable, there must be something wrong with her." Garrett looked at Ellis for a moment. "And what did Whitley think?" "Whitley repeated it," Ellis said, "which means he doesn't disagree." Garrett returned to the ledger. "Thank you." Ellis picked up the tin cup. "You know how this goes once the women like Aldrich get something between their teeth." "I know how it goes. I'm just saying, it's going to get worse before it gets better." "It usually does." Garrett turned a page. "That'll be all, Ellis." It got worse. In August, one of the merchants, a dry goods man named Pullman, who everyone knew was in debt to the Forsyth estate and therefore in Helena Forsyth's pocket, told Mara that he couldn't extend her credit anymore. She hadn't had much credit to speak of, just enough to buy the occasional staple when her wages from the Harlans were delayed. But Pullman delivered the refusal in the middle of his store in front of 4 other customers, loudly, with a pointed look that was meant to communicate something beyond the simple financial matter. Mara came back to the Harlan house that afternoon quieter than usual. Tom Harlan Sr. sat with her on the porch step that evening, and she told him what had happened without particular emotion, just the facts of it. "He can do what he wants," Tom said. He was a slow-talking man, fair-minded in the way of people who had struggled enough to develop sympathy for others struggling. "His store, his credit, but I know why he did it. Because of Kane. Because of Aldrich and Forsyth and everybody else who's got an opinion about who Garrett Kane ought to be with." Tom looked out across his small pasture. "They don't like you, Mara. I mean, they don't like what you represent." "What do I represent?" He was quiet for a moment. "That he'd choose someone like you over someone like them." She thought about that. "I haven't chosen anything. He's the one." "You didn't walk away," Tom said. "In this valley, that's the same as choosing." She was quiet for a while. The evening came in slowly, the way it did in summer, the light changing over the ridge. "Do you think I should?" she asked. Not anxiously. She didn't ask things anxiously, just as a genuine question. Tom turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man who has made enough decisions in his life to know how hard they are. "I think you should do what's honest," he said. "I don't know what that is. Only you do." September brought the beginning of what people would later call the season of small cruelties. It wasn't dramatic. It was the accumulation of 100 small things, the kind of things that are hard to name individually but that add up to a wall. Women who had been cordial to Mara in passing became suddenly unavailable. Ranch hands from other operations stopped working alongside her. There'd been an informal arrangement where the valley's hired help would sometimes share labor during heavy seasons, and that arrangement quietly dried up. A water trough on the edge of the Harlan property that butted against a neighboring fence got mysteriously blocked with debris. Nothing that could be directly attributed to anyone, just the valley's machinery grinding in a particular direction. Mara fixed the water trough herself on a Tuesday morning and didn't say anything about it to anyone. But Garrett heard. He always heard. He rode to her, not to the Harlan place, but to where she was working in the north pasture, mending fence again, which seemed to be a permanent condition of the Harlan property, and he pulled his horse up and dismounted. She looked up. The sun was full on her face, and she was sweating, and there was a smear of rust from the wire on her left cheek, and she made no move to do anything about any of it. "I've been hearing things," he said. "I imagine you have. Are you all right?" She was quiet for a moment. She seemed to be deciding something. "I'm not fragile, if that's what you're asking." "I'm not asking if you're fragile, I'm asking if you're all right." She looked at him directly. "Why does it matter to you?" It was the first time she had asked him anything directly about his intentions, and it landed between them with some weight. He said, "Because it does." She held his gaze. "That's not much of an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He paused. "I'm not good at this kind of talking." "I know you're not." A pause. "What kind are you good at?" "The kind where I tell you what I'm actually thinking." "Go ahead then." He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, a rare gesture of discomfort from a man who was almost never visibly uncomfortable. "I've been watching you work for 5 months. I've talked to you I don't know how many times, and every time I leave, I find myself thinking more clearly than I have in years. I don't know what that means entirely, but I know I don't want to stop." She was quiet for a long moment. A hawk turned somewhere in the distance, and she watched it without seeming to. "You understand what comes with this," she said. "What they'll say. What they're already saying." "I've heard what they're saying. It'll get worse." "Probably." She looked at him again. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but the lowering of some particular guard. "I'm not easy," she said. "I don't do things to make people comfortable. I say what I think, and I don't pretend otherwise, and I don't know how to be what those women are." "I know that. And you still, and I still." Another long pause. "All right," she said finally. She sounded like she was agreeing to something reasonable, like a supply arrangement, but her eyes, those gray eyes, had something in them that hadn't been there before. "All right." She turned back to the fence. He stood there for another moment, then went back to his horse. He was halfway back to his property before he realized he was smiling, which was not an expression his face was much accustomed to. October hardened the valley. The cold came early that year. Not the killing kind, not yet, but the preliminary cold that tightens everything and makes people shorter with each other. The ranchers began their autumn calculations, counting cattle and hay stores and deciding who had enough to last the winter and who didn't. The Harlan operation, Garrett knew, was going to be tight. They'd had a reasonable cattle season, but their hay crop had been short, and with Tom Sr. still not at full strength, they hadn't been able to put up as much as they needed. Mara had pushed the hay work as hard as she could. He'd seen her out there in September, working past dark 2 evenings running, but there was only so much one person could do. He sent 10 tons of hay to the Harlan place in the first week of October, listed in his ledger simply as a barter arrangement for some fence labor. Tom Harlan sent his son over to say thank you. Mara appeared at the Kane Ranch gate 2 days later. Ellis saw her first and came to tell Garrett, with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has decided not to have opinions about his employer's personal life. Garrett went to the gate. She was standing there in her work coat, the plain brown one, hat in her hands, and she said without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." "Tom needed hay. You did it because of me." "I did it because Tom needed hay and I had hay to spare," he said. Then, after a moment, "And because of you." She looked at the ground, then back at him. There was something in her face that looked, just briefly, like the particular expression of someone who is not accustomed to being considered. "I don't want to be a charity project." "You're not." "I want to be sure you know the difference." He leaned on the gatepost. "The difference between what?" "Between what I am and what people think I need. She met his eyes. I'm not looking to be rescued. I didn't come here to be rescued. I know what I'm doing, and I know what I'm worth, and I don't need... She stopped. I just need to know you know that. Mara. He waited until she was looking at him squarely. I've watched you hold up an operation that should have folded 6 months ago. I know what you're worth. That's the entire point. A silence. The wind moved through the fence line. Then thank you, she said finally, for the hay. You're welcome. She put her hat back on. I'll send Tom over for the fence work. He owes you. He does. She turned and walked back down the road. He watched her go. The first snow came at the end of October, a foot overnight that stopped everything for 3 days. In the white stillness that followed, Blackthorn Ridge huddled inward, and the valley's social machinery slowed to the pace of rumors passed between households. The rumors about Garrett Kane and Mara Quinn had not slowed. If anything, the early winter had concentrated them. People had less to do and more time to talk. Constance Aldrich had apparently told 3 separate households that she intended to have a formal conversation with Garrett about the impropriety of his association with a woman of no standing. Helena Forsyth had been heard to say that Mara had probably done something she shouldn't have to secure the hay arrangement, the implication of which was ugly enough that even some of the people who repeated it looked uncomfortable doing so. Tom Harlan, who heard this version, told Garrett about it on a morning when Garrett had ridden out to check on how the Harlan cattle had come through the first snow. Garrett listened without moving his expression. I thought you should know, Tom said. I'm sorry to be the one to say it. I appreciate you telling me. Tom looked at him for a moment. What are you going to do? Nothing yet, Garrett said. Nothing that needs doing yet. He went home and sat in his study for a long time, not doing anything with the ledger on the desk in front of him. He was thinking about the specific quality of cruelty that required no direct act, that operated entirely through implication and repetition, that could destroy a person standing in a community without a single direct accusation anyone could argue against. He was also thinking about Mara's face when she had said, I know what I'm worth. The way it had come out level and clear, but the way she had had to stop and collect herself before she said it. He knew what she was worth. He needed everyone else to know it too. But the way to make that happen was not going to be a confrontation in someone's parlor. The way it was going to happen, if it happened at all, was through time and through evidence. Through the valley's simple arithmetic of who did the work and who didn't. He just didn't know yet how long it was going to take, or what the winter was going to ask of all of them before the accounting was done. November settled over the valley cold and specific, the mountains holding snow that hadn't been there a year ago in the same quantities, the river running lower than any of the older ranchers could remember for that time of year. Garrett noticed it. He noticed everything about his land and his water and his weather. He spent the first 2 weeks of November going over the previous 3 years of his own records. Rainfall tallies, river levels, snowpack estimates, and the pattern he found in those numbers kept him awake 2 nights running. He didn't say anything about it yet. The numbers were concerning, not conclusive. He needed the winter to play out before he understood what he was seeing, but he found himself watching the mountains more than usual, and noting the level of the river crossing more carefully than he had to. One afternoon in the 3rd week of November, he rode out past the Harlan place and saw Mara in the north pasture, which had become something like their place, in the casual, unspoken way that places become someone's without being named. She was checking the cattle, counting, moving through the herd with the easy manner of someone the cattle knew. He didn't have a reason to stop. He stopped anyway. She came to the fence and they stood on either side of it, which was a comfortable arrangement they had arrived at without discussion. Close enough to talk, far enough that neither of them had to think about what it meant that they were standing so close. You've been looking at the mountains, she said. He glanced at her. How do you know that? Because I've been looking at them too. She turned to face the northern ridge. The snowpack's wrong. He was quiet for a moment. What do you mean, wrong? Too much in some places and too little in others. And the river level, she stopped. Tom says it's normal variation, but I've been tracking it since I got here and it's not. She looked at him directly. Is it? He took a breath. No, he said. It's not. She received this the way she received most information, without drama, just taking it in and turning it over. How bad could it be? She asked. I don't know yet. Best case. Dry spring, some water rationing, difficult but manageable. Worst case. He looked at the mountains for a moment. Real trouble, he said, the kind that can unmake a valley. She was quiet. A gust moved through the pasture and the cattle shifted. Does anyone else know? She asked. I don't know what anyone else knows. You should tell them. I know. They won't thank you for it. I know that too. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not pity and not sympathy exactly, but something more useful. The look of one person who is good at hard things recognizing it in another. You'll tell them anyway, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, he said. I will. A pause. The afternoon was losing its light, the ridge going purple-gray. Winter's long, she said finally, not to him, just to the air. Then she looked back at the cattle and said quietly, Come find me when you're ready to talk about what to do. He looked at her. She wasn't offering comfort. She was offering utility, the plainest and most valuable thing one person could offer another in a place like Blackthorn Ridge. I will, he said. He rode home in the early dark, and the mountains behind him held their snow, and the river somewhere below ran low and quiet and patient, and the winter that was coming did not know or care about social positions or covered dishes or the careful calculations of the wealthy women in the valley's parlors. It was just coming, and when it arrived fully, everything that was real would have to prove itself. December arrived without ceremony and without mercy. The cold that settled over Blackthorn Ridge in the first week of that month was the serious kind, not the sharp, clean cold of early autumn, but the deep, settled cold that gets into the walls of buildings and the joints of older men and the soil itself, and does not leave until it is ready. The river at the crossing dropped another 6 inches. Garrett measured it. He noted it in his ledger with the same handwriting he used for cattle counts and hay tallies, as if he could make the number less alarming by keeping it neat. He had said what he needed to say to the other ranchers in the valley. He had called an informal meeting at the Merchants' Hall in late November. Not a social occasion, just a meeting, though the distinction was lost on some people, and laid out what he was seeing in the snowpack and the river levels. He had brought his 3 years of records. He had spoken plainly and without exaggeration and without telling anyone what to do, because men like the ranchers of Blackthorn Ridge did not respond well to being told what to do. The response had been mixed, which was the best he had expected. Edgar Foss, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the valley, had listened carefully and nodded and said he'd review his own water access. 2 of the smaller operators had looked at the numbers and gone pale. The others had done what people do when they hear something they don't want to hear. They had found reasons why it probably wasn't as serious as it looked, why this winter was probably just a variation on normal, why Garrett Kane had always been a worrier. Constance Aldrich, who attended the meeting because the Aldrich timber operation depended on water as much as anyone, had sat in the second row and watched Garrett talk and then had gone home and told Helena Forsyth that the meeting was a performance, that Garrett was trying to look important, that the whole presentation had been, and this was the word she used, Helena later repeated it, theatrical. It got back to Garrett. Things always got back to Garrett. He didn't say anything about it. He went back to his ranch and continued watching the river and continued keeping his records and began thinking seriously and specifically about the worst case. It was in this context that he and Mara began talking in earnest, not about anything personal. What they talked about was water, where it came from, where it went, what happened when it didn't come. Mara had grown up in the southern part of the territory where water was always the problem, where a bad year could take a family's entire operation in one season. And she had the particular education of someone who had watched water scarcity from close up. She understood it the way you understood something that had already hurt you once. They met twice a week through December, usually in the early evening at the Harlan place, sometimes with Tom Sr. present, sometimes just the 2 of them at the kitchen table with Garrett's map spread out across it. They talked about the canyon system to the north, an old watercourse that had been redirected decades back when the original settlement was built, that theoretically still connected to a mountain basin above the valley. Nobody had used it in 20 years. Nobody was sure it was still viable. The problem isn't whether the water's up there, Mara said one evening, tracing the line on the map with her finger. The problem is the canyon between here and there. What's wrong with the canyon? Nobody's been through it in years. The old timber crews used to clear it. Nobody's done that work since. She looked at the map. There could be anything in there, rockfall, debris blockages. The channel itself might have shifted. She paused. And it would need to be done before the drought hit, not after. Once you're in a full drought, you don't have the people or the energy for an expedition like that. So it would need to happen in spring, Garrett said. Early spring, before the dry season. Tom, who had been listening from his chair by the stove, said, "Nobody's going to go for it, you know that. You tell people they need to go into the canyon before the drought, and they'll say you're just guessing about the drought." "I know," Garrett said. "So what do you do?" Garrett looked at the map for a long moment. "I go anyway," he said, "and I make sure the right people know about it." Mara was quiet, looking at the map. "That canyon is not a simple ride," she said. "I don't know it firsthand, but I've talked to a man who does. It's a full 2-day journey in, minimum. The terrain—" She stopped, looking at something in the map's topography. "You'd want at least 6 people, more if you're going to do any real channel work. Can you find 6 people who aren't scared off?" She looked up at him. "I can find them," she said. "Whether they'll come after they hear the rest of the valley talking is another question." And that was the other question, the one that hung over all of it. Because by December, the rest of the valley had things to say, and what they said had gotten considerably sharper than gossip about the social propriety of Garrett Kane's interest in a laborer girl. It had moved, with the efficiency of a cold season and too much indoor time, into something uglier. The specific accusation, and it had hardened now into an accusation, though still the kind nobody said directly to anyone's face, was that Mara Quinn had manufactured her usefulness, that she had positioned herself, that everything she did on the Harlan property and the careful attention she paid to ranch problems and water tables was calculated, was an extended performance designed to secure herself a wealthy husband and a way out of poverty. Constance Aldrich had apparently used the word predatory in Helena Forsyth's parlor, and that word, like all well-chosen ugly words, had traveled. Mara found out about it the way she found out about most things, from young Tom Harlan, who told her with the directness of a 14-year-old who doesn't yet know how to soften things. She was splitting wood behind the Harlan barn when he told her. She kept splitting wood while he talked. When he was done, she drove the axe into the block and left it there, and stood with her back to him for a moment. "All right," she said, "you're not—" Tom stopped. "Doesn't that make you angry?" "Yes," she said. "It makes me angry." Then nothing. She turned around. Her face was controlled the way it always was, but there was something in her eyes that was not controlled. "What do you want me to do, Tom? Go to Forsyth's parlor and make a scene? That's what they want. That's what proves them right." "It's not fair." "No," she said. "It's not." She reached for the axe. "Go tell your father supper's in an hour." Tom stood there for a moment longer, looking at her with the helpless expression of someone who has correctly identified an injustice and has no way to fix it. Then he went. Mara split wood until her arms were tired, not because they needed that much wood, just because she needed to do something with her hands. Later that evening, she sat at the kitchen table after the Harlans had gone to bed, and she thought about the word predatory and what it meant that this was what some people saw when they looked at her. Not a woman working to survive, not a woman with knowledge and capability, but a schemer, a hunter. The threat. She had grown up poor and she understood, in the bone-deep way you understood things that had always been true, that this was one of the costs of it, that the world made certain assumptions about people who needed things. That need was read as motive, and motive as manipulation, and somewhere in that translation, the actual person disappeared. What surprised her, and she didn't like that it surprised her, because it made her feel naive, was how much it still hurt. After all the years of understanding exactly how the world worked, it still sat in her chest like a coal. She went to bed eventually. She slept because she was practical enough to know she needed to. In the morning, she got up and went back to work. That was what she knew how to do. It was not a cure for anything, but it was what she had. It was Garrett who confronted it directly, and he did it in a way she didn't expect. He showed up at the dry goods store, Pullman's store, the man who had cut her credit in front of customers, on a Wednesday morning in December when she happened to be there picking up a supply order for Tom Harlan. She was waiting at the counter while Pullman filled the order with the particular deliberate slowness of a man who has decided to be unpleasant without being technically rude when Garrett walked in. He saw her. He saw Pullman. He read the room in about 2 seconds. He walked to the counter and said, "Morning, Pullman." Pullman looked up. He had the expression of a man who is suddenly uncomfortable in a situation he had thought was in his control. "Mr. Kane, what can I need to settle the Quinn account," Garrett said. A silence. "I wasn't aware Miss Quinn had an—" Pullman started. "Her credit should be extended the same as any working person in this valley. I'll stand behind it personally." Garrett said this without volume, without drama, in the same tone he used when he told Ellis to move cattle to the south pasture. "Whatever she needs, put it on my account until I set up a separate arrangement." Pullman looked between Garrett and Mara. He wanted to object. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But he was also a man who owed the Kane operation a significant amount of business, and he was doing the arithmetic behind his eyes. "Of course," he said. He turned back to filling the order, with less deliberate slowness than before. Mara didn't say anything while they were in the store. They walked out together into the cold gray December air, and she stopped on the boardwalk. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't. It's going to make it worse." She was looking up at him without anger, just stating the fact clearly. "You know that. Every time you do something like that, they say it again. That I'm using you, that this is what I wanted." "I know what they say." Garrett looked down the empty main street of Blackthorn Ridge, at the smoke rising from chimneys, at the gray sky above the ridge. "I'm not going to pretend I don't see it happening because I'm worried about what Constance Aldrich is telling her friends. It affects me, not you," she said. "They can't hurt you. What they say, it follows me. It's my name they use." He turned to look at her directly. "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because it's wrong," he said. "And because I'm not going to stand in Pullman's store and watch it happen and pretend I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something working in her face that she was not quite succeeding at controlling. Not sentiment. Mara didn't do sentiment. But something genuine and complicated and not easily named. "You're a difficult man," she said finally. "So I've been told." A pause. A wagon moved down the street somewhere behind them. "Thank you," she said, quietly, in a way that cost her something. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said, exactly echoing him, and he caught it, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped off the boardwalk. "I've got Tom's supplies to get back." "I know." She walked toward the wagon without looking back. He stood there for a moment, and he was aware, with the particular clarity of a cold morning, that this was the thing. This was the specific woman. Not because she was easy or uncomplicated or grateful in the simple ways that people wanted, but because she was honest, all the way down. And honesty in a person was rarer than anything else on earth. He went back to his horse. Behind the curtain of Pullman's storefront window, a figure watched him go. By nightfall, the story of what had happened in the dry goods store was in 3 different households. By morning, it was in most of the valley. The version Constance Aldrich heard had Mara crying and Garrett standing over her protectively, like some romantic scene from a cheap novel. The version she told Helena Forsythe was worse. What Constance felt, underneath all the carefully arranged social language, was something simpler and less flattering. She felt humiliated, not by anything Mara had done, by the fact that Garrett Kane, with every eligible and established woman in the valley to choose from, kept choosing this. It made no sense to her, and things that made no sense to Constance Aldrich made her dangerous. In January, 2 things happened. The first was that Garrett rode to the Forsythe property on a cold Tuesday morning and had a conversation with Helena Forsythe that nobody was present for, and that Helena never repeated in detail, though its effects were visible. The specific cruelties slowed. The word predatory stopped traveling. The machinery of the valley's social judgment didn't stop, but it downshifted. Nobody knew exactly what he said. Ellis asked once, and Garrett told him it was a business conversation, which Ellis correctly interpreted as meaning none of his concern. The second thing that happened in January was that Mara repaired the Jennings roof. The Jennings were a small family at the south edge of the valley, not connected to any of the larger operations, not wealthy, not influential. They had a 7-year-old and a baby and a roof that had been borderline the previous summer and had collapsed in a section after a heavy snowfall in early January. Mara was riding back from a supply run when she saw them, the mother outside in the cold, the father on what remained of the roof in the middle of a snowstorm, clearly without the skills or materials to fix it. She stopped. She went over. She asked what they had for materials, looked at what was left of the damage, went back to the Harlan place, got what she needed, came back with Tom Jr., and spent the rest of that day and the next morning making the roof functional. She didn't announce this. She didn't tell Garrett. She just did it, the way she did everything, because it was in front of her and it needed doing, but the valley saw. The Jennings had neighbors, and the neighbors had seen Mara arrive in the snowstorm with lumber, and they had seen her up on that roof in the cold doing work most men would have called a professional job. Slowly, the way slow things happen, a different story began to take shape alongside the first one. Not loudly, not quickly, but it was there. The story of the woman who fixed the Harlan fences and helped 3 families through the autumn, who showed up in a snowstorm with lumber and climbed someone else's broken roof without being asked. Constance Aldrich's version of Mara was a schemer with an agenda. The Jennings version of Mara was a woman who showed up. Both versions were in the valley now, competing the way stories compete, not with arguments, but with evidence. Winter ground on. The river dropped another 4 inches in February. Garrett's ledger held the numbers. He stopped sleeping well, and when he did sleep, he woke with the particular alertness of a man whose instincts are trying to tell him something. The spring was coming, and when it came, whatever the winter had been holding back was going to show itself. He was not ready. He wasn't sure anyone was. But in the mornings, when the cold was still absolute and the valley was still buried in white, he would sometimes ride the long way back from the river and pass by the Harlan place, and through the kitchen window he could see the yellow light of a lamp and the figure of Mara Quinn at the table, doing whatever needed doing. And it helped, in a way he couldn't have explained and wouldn't have tried to. The woman was there. She was steady. And whatever was coming, they would figure it out or they wouldn't, but they would figure it out together. That was enough to sleep on. March came in mean. The snow that fell in the last week of February didn't melt the way it should have. It sat on the ground and hardened into a gray crust, and beneath it the soil stayed frozen 2 weeks past, when the old ranchers said it ought to have thawed. The river at the crossing had dropped to a level that made Garrett's jaw tighten every time he measured it. He stopped sharing the numbers with Ellis because Ellis had started looking at them with an expression that wasn't useful to anyone. The valley's mood had shifted with the season. The social frictions of winter, the parlor gossip, the careful cruelties, had not disappeared, but they had been overtaken by something larger and less personal. People were beginning to understand, in the slow and resistant way that people understand things they don't want to, that the water problem was real. The wells in the south pastures were running shallow. 2 of the smaller operations had lost cattle to dehydration in February, which was something none of them had ever seen in winter before. Edgar Foss rode to the Kane Ranch on a Tuesday morning in early March and sat in Garrett's study with his hat in his hands and said, without particular preamble, "I think you were right." "I know," Garrett said, which was not gracious but was honest. "What do we do?" Garrett unrolled the map on the desk between them. "There's a plan," he said. "I've been working on it with someone who knows water systems. I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." Foss looked at the map. He was a careful man, not imaginative, but thorough, and he traced the canyon route with his finger the same way Mara had, with the same instinct to measure distances against terrain. "Who's the someone?" "Mara Quinn." Foss was quiet for a moment. "The Quinn girl. The one working the Harlan place." "Yes." Another pause. Garrett waited, because he knew what was happening behind Foss's eyes. The calculation between the social position of the source and the seriousness of the problem. He watched Foss work through it. "Tell me the plan," Foss said finally. That was the beginning of it. Over the following 2 weeks, Garrett and Mara presented the canyon plan to 7 of the valley's larger operators, sometimes together, sometimes separately. The response was predictable in its variation. Some listened carefully and asked practical questions. Some resisted on principle, and a few dismissed it outright in ways that had less to do with the plan's merits than with the fact that part of it had come from a woman most of them had spent the winter looking down on. What shifted things was the well. On the 15th of March, the Brennan family's main well, not a shallow well, a deep one that had served their operation for 11 years, went dry. The Brennans ran 300 head and had 4 children and no secondary water source. When word reached the merchant's hall that same afternoon, the conversation changed character entirely. It was no longer theoretical. The drought that Garrett had been charting in ledger numbers was now a fact sitting in the middle of someone's yard in the shape of a dry hole. Mara heard about the Brennan well from Tom Harlan Sr. She was in the barn at the time, treating a calf with a respiratory infection, and she finished what she was doing before she said anything. "How deep was their well?" she asked. 30 feet, Tom said. "Maybe 32. She wiped her hands on a rag. "Ours is shallower than that." Tom's face confirmed he knew. "I've been watching it. We should move the cattle to the north pasture, closer to the creek," she was thinking as she spoke. "The creek's fed from a different source than the wells. It'll hold longer, not forever, but longer." She looked at him. "Do you have the hands for it?" "With your help." "You have my help." She was already working through the next problem. "But Tom, the creek won't last either. Not if this continues." She looked at the barn door, at the gray March sky beyond it. "We need the canyon plan to work." Garrett's got people talking. Talking isn't the same as going. He couldn't argue with that. The expedition assembled in the last week of March, and it assembled imperfectly. The way real things assemble, with people dropping out at the last moment and unexpected ones stepping forward, with equipment that wasn't quite right, and arguments about who would lead what part of the operation. 6 people in the end. Garrett, Ellis, a ranch hand named Cord who was 26 and strong and not particularly bright, but was the most physically capable man on the Kane property. Edgar Foss sent his foreman, a quiet man named Birch, who knew the northern terrain better than most. And 2 people who surprised everyone by volunteering, Tom Harlan Jr., who was 14 and whom Mara initially refused and then relented on when it became clear he would simply follow them anyway, and Mara herself. When Garrett told her the expedition was coming together, she had simply said, "I'm going." "It's going to be rough country," he said. "I know what kind of country it is." "Mara, I drew the maps," she said flatly. "I know the plan better than anyone going. You need me there." She looked at him with the level directness that was simply her nature. "You know that." He did know that. He also knew, and did not say, that he was afraid for her in a way he was not accustomed to being afraid for anyone, and that this fear was not rational and was not something she would have welcomed hearing. "All right," he said. She nodded and went back to what she'd been doing. They left on a cold, colorless morning at the end of March, before the valley was fully awake. Garrett had not announced the departure broadly. He didn't want a scene, didn't want the discouragement of people who had already decided the plan was impossible. So it was only Tom Harlan Sr. and his wife standing at the gate to watch them go. And the valley was still quiet and gray behind them when they turned north toward the ridge. The first day was hard but uncomplicated. The terrain north of the valley proper was rocky and irregular, dotted with scrub pine and broken by small ravines that required picking careful routes around. They made 8 miles by midday and stopped to rest the horses at a creek that was, as Mara noted without comment, running at roughly half the volume it should have been. Cord looked at the creek and then at Mara. "You said this one would last longer than the wells." "Longer," she said. "I didn't say forever." He absorbed this and said nothing else. The first real obstacle came on the afternoon of the second day, when they reached the canyon mouth. It was a narrow entrance, the walls rising maybe 60 feet on either side, choked at the opening with 2 decades of deadfall, timber and brush and rockfall debris that had accumulated since anyone had last cleared the passage. Standing in front of it, the 6 of them looked at the obstruction in silence for a moment. "That's going to take most of a day just to clear the entrance," Birch said. He said it neutrally, the way a man states a fact, not a complaint. "Then we start now," Garrett said, and dismounted. They worked until the light was gone, 4 of them clearing debris while Birch managed the horses on the approach trail, and young Tom hauled the cleared material away from the opening. It was exhausting and monotonous work, the kind that takes the conversation out of people, and by the time they stopped for the night, they had cleared maybe 40 feet of entrance passage, and everyone had cuts on their hands from deadfall branches. They camped at the canyon mouth. Mara made a fire and heated what they had, beans and dried meat, nothing elaborate. And they ate mostly in silence. Ellis turned in early. Cord was asleep before Ellis. Birch sat with his back against a rock and closed his eyes without quite sleeping, in the way of experienced men on trail. Tom Jr. sat beside Mara and said quietly, "Is it going to get worse than this?" "Yes," she said. "How much worse?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know. I've never been through this particular canyon." She looked at the fire. "But if you want to go back—" "I don't want to go back," he said with the quick dignity of a 14-year-old who does not want to be thought afraid. "I know," she said. "I'm just giving you the option while it's still easy." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever want to go back? From something hard?" She turned to look at him. "Every time," she said. He seemed to find this more reassuring than if she'd said no. He went to his bedroll shortly after. Garrett was sitting on the other side of the fire, reviewing the map by firelight. He had been aware of the conversation without appearing to listen to it, in the practiced way of a man who has learned to absorb information without drawing attention to the fact. "He's a good kid," Garrett said when Tom was out of earshot. "He is." Mara was feeding the fire small pieces of dead wood. "He works harder than most men I've known twice his age." "You've been good for that family." She shifted slightly. "They've been good for me." A pause. The fire moved between them. "How's your hand?" he asked. She had cut her left palm on a piece of rusted wire during the clearing work, and though she'd wrapped it without making anything of it, he'd noticed it. "Fine. Let me see it." She held it toward the firelight with the expression of someone tolerating an unnecessary procedure. He leaned forward and looked at the wrapping. It was competently done. She did most things competently, but the cloth was showing a spot of blood at the center. "It needs tighter," he said. "It's fine, Garrett." He had a strip of clean cloth in his pack, because he was a man who carried what was practical, and a tight bandage was practical. And he rewrapped her hand with a care that she submitted to with the slightly stiff patience of a person who is not accustomed to being tended to. His hands were larger than hers by a considerable margin, and they were not graceful hands. They were working hands, scarred and weathered, but they were careful. When he was done, she looked at the bandage, then at him. "Thank you," she said. The same way she always said it, like it cost her something, which made it worth something. He nodded and went back to the map. The second day in the canyon was worse. They got through the entrance obstruction by mid-morning and pushed into the canyon proper, and the canyon proper was everything Mara had warned it might be. Narrower than the map suggested, with a floor that was alternately loose rock and mud-soft soil from old water movement, and in two places actively blocked by rockfall that required an hour of clearing each. The walls pressed in and the sky above was a narrow strip of pale gray, and the horses were unhappy about all of it, requiring constant management from Birch to keep them from turning back on their own. It was in the second rockfall clearing, early afternoon, everyone tired and short-tempered, that the argument happened. It started with Cord, which surprised no one who knew Cord. He had been quiet all morning in the way of a man who is building toward something, and when the second rockfall appeared ahead of them, he stopped and said flatly, "This is foolish." Everyone stopped. "We've been at this a day and a half," Cord said. "We're clearing the same obstacles we'd have to come back and clear anyway if we're going to redirect water through here. We don't know if the channel above is even viable. We're out here on the say-so of—" He paused, and his eyes moved to Mara. "A plan that nobody's tested." The silence that followed was the specific kind produced when someone says a thing that three other people have been thinking and not saying. Garrett said, "Cord, I'm just saying what's true. You're saying it like you want to quit. I'm saying it like a man who wants to know what we're actually doing out here." Garrett turned to face him fully, and his expression was the expression of a man who has given an instruction and is now deciding whether to explain himself or simply repeat it. He generally preferred to repeat it. It was Mara who spoke first. "The channel above the second bend," she said, "without heat, without defensiveness, just the information. That's what we need to reach. If the channel is clear and the basin is holding water, which, based on the snowpack readings from February it should be, then this whole system can be opened up. We're not just clearing obstacles for the sake of it. We're checking the source." She looked at Cord directly. If we get to the second bend and the basin is dry, I'll be the first to say it didn't work and we ride back. Fair? Isheum. Ish. Shawashu. Cord looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been arguing with someone he expected to argue back differently. Fair, he said eventually. They kept moving. The second bend was 4 more hours of difficult terrain, and they reached it in late afternoon with the light already angling low through the canyon walls. Mara went ahead on foot for the last quarter mile because the footing was too uncertain for the horses, and Garrett followed her, and they came around the bend together and stopped. The basin was not dry. It was not the full mountain lake that the oldest maps of the territory had indicated. That might be gone, or accessible only higher up, but it was real water, a substantial pool fed from somewhere above by snowmelt, sitting behind a natural rock shelf that had been partially blocking its flow southward. The channel on the near side of that shelf was clogged with decades of sediment and debris, but the water itself was there, and it was clean, and there was more of it than either of them had dared to expect. Mara stood at the edge of the channel looking at it. Garrett stood beside her. She said nothing for a moment. Then she crouched and put her hand in the water. It was ice cold, running off the mountain above, and she stayed like that for a few seconds. When she stood up, she turned to him. "It's workable," she said. Her voice was steady, but something behind it wasn't. Not tears. That wasn't Mara. But something tightly held, the feeling of a person who has argued for something no one believed in and turned out to be right and doesn't quite know what to do with that yet. "Yeah," Garrett said. "We'll need a crew, real equipment. It's going to take 2 weeks at minimum to clear the channel and rebuild the flow control. We'll get the crew." People are going to say, "Mara." He turned to look at her directly, the canyon light going gold above them. "You were right. That's all there is to it." She held his gaze for a moment. Somewhere behind them, Ellis and Birch were bringing the horses around the last turn, and Cord's voice carried up the canyon saying something to young Tom. The world was about to get loud again, and practical, and full of the next problem. But for a moment they just stood there beside the water, two people who had come a long way on an argument nobody else believed, and let it be true. The ride back began the next morning. It was harder than the ride in. The horses knew they were going home and fought the careful pace the terrain required, and everyone was tired in the deep way that comes after sustained difficult work. Nobody talked much. Tom Jr. slept in the saddle for an hour on the second afternoon until his horse stumbled on loose rock and woke him, and Mara caught the bridle before the horse could startle and held it steady without saying a word about it. They came out of the canyon mouth on the 4th day, back into the open country above the valley, and the sky was enormous after the narrow walls, and the valley below them, Blackthorn Ridge, its rooftops and its pastures and its thin thread of river, looked smaller than any of them expected. Fragile, almost. The kind of place that could disappear if the right things went wrong. But it was also the place they were going back to, with news, with a plan that wasn't theoretical anymore. Garrett sat his horse at the high point of the trail and looked down at it for a moment. He could feel the others waiting behind him. "Let's go," he said, and turned his horse toward the valley. They rode back into Blackthorn Ridge on a Thursday afternoon, and the valley looked exactly the same as when they'd left it. The same gray-brown pastures, the same smoke rising from chimneys, the same mountain silhouette to the north, and yet something was different, and the difference was in the people who had stayed behind. The drought had not waited for them. In the 8 days they'd been in the canyon, 2 more wells had gone dry. A rancher named Calloway had lost 40 head when his main water trough dried up faster than he'd expected, and he hadn't moved the cattle in time. The south pastures were hard and cracked in a way that April soil had no business being, and the creek that Mara had pointed Tom Harlan toward in March was running at a trickle that wouldn't sustain 300 head through another week. Garrett learned all of this from Ellis within an hour of returning. He listened to it standing in the barn, still trail dirty, too tired to sit. "How are people?" he asked. Ellis knew what he was really asking. "Scared," he said, "and scared people get stupid fast." The stupid had already started. Garrett heard about it over the following 2 days as the valley's reaction to the crisis took shape. Not organized, not rational, just the various ways that people who feel powerless start trying to exert control over something. The Forsyth grain operation had quietly doubled the price on its remaining feedstock, which was legal and also the kind of thing that would be remembered for 20 years. Two of the smaller operators had gotten into a genuine physical altercation over a shared water access point, and a rumor had begun moving through the valley. Garrett couldn't find its origin, but it had Constance Aldrich's fingerprints on it, that the canyon expedition had been a failure, that they'd found nothing, that it had been a waste of time and resources that the valley couldn't afford. He addressed the rumor at a meeting of the valley's operators on the second evening after his return, in the Merchants' Hall, in front of 43 people. He put the map on the table and told them what they had found, simply and specifically, and then he told them what the work would require. Crews, equipment, 2 weeks minimum, every able-bodied man the valley could spare. He also said Mara Quinn's name. Said it clearly, said it first, said the plan was hers, and the expedition had proven it viable, and that was not a matter of opinion. The hall was quiet, in a way that could have been respect or could have been resistance. It was hard to tell the difference in a room full of people who hadn't decided what they thought yet. Edgar Foss spoke first. "What's the timeline if we start now?" "Water back in the main channel in 3 weeks," Garrett said. "Possibly 2.5 if the clearing goes faster than the first survey suggested." "And if we don't start now?" Garrett said. "You've seen Calloway's herd. You know what another 3 weeks without adequate water means." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The room turned to its own internal calculations, the specific arithmetic of risk and survival that people in difficult country were always running. Slowly, by ones and twos, the operators began to commit. Not all of them. A few held out, either because they genuinely doubted the plan, or because committing to something Mara Quinn had designed felt like a concession they weren't prepared to make. Garrett noted who those people were and moved on. He didn't have the time or the patience to argue anyone into saving their own cattle. Mara was not at the meeting. She had gone directly back to the Harlan property on their return and spent the first 2 days doing the work that had been piling up there. The creek diversion she'd planned, additional water storage using every barrel the Harlans owned, a rationing system for the livestock that would stretch what they had as far as it would go. She did this without fanfare, without telling anyone to watch, because there was simply no time for anything else. It was Tom Harlan Sr. who told her what had happened at the meeting. She was eating a late supper when he came in and laid it out. What Garrett had said, who had committed, who hadn't. "He said your name," Tom said. "In front of everyone." She looked at her plate for a moment. How did they take it? Mixed. He sat down across from her. Some of them were fine with it. Some of them looked like they'd bitten something sour. That's about what I expected. Helena Forsythe walked out. Mara looked up. Before Garrett even finished talking, just stood up and left. Tom folded his hands on the table. Took her foreman with her, so they're out. "The Forsythe water access is on the East Channel," Mara said, thinking out loud. "If the main channel restoration works, it benefits them regardless of whether they helped. They'll get the water either way. I know that, so does everyone else. It doesn't matter right now." She pushed her plate aside. "What matters is how many crews he has for the canyon." "Enough," Tom said. "Not comfortable, but enough." She nodded. "When do they start?" "Day after tomorrow." She stood up and carried her plate to the basin. "Then I need to be there." "Mara," Tom's voice was careful. "You just got back." "I know. You've been working 16-hour days since you got back." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "You're allowed to rest." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that was not quite irritation, more like the expression of someone who has heard a thing that is true and doesn't currently have anywhere to put it. "I'll rest when the water's in," she said, not harshly, just as a statement of how things were. Tom looked at her for a moment with the particular expression he sometimes got, not pity, because she would not have tolerated pity, but something that resembled it in the quieter way of a man who has known struggle himself and recognizes it in someone he cares about. He didn't say anything else. He knew better. The crew work in the canyon began on a Saturday, and it was harder than the initial expedition had been because it was a larger operation, 14 men in addition to Garrett and Mara, with equipment that had to be hauled through terrain that barely accommodated horses, let alone the heavy tools needed for channel clearing and bank reinforcement. The logistics alone took a full day to sort out, and by the end of the first day in the canyon, 3 of the 14 men had decided they hadn't signed up for this particular level of difficulty and had gone back to the valley. Garrett watched them go without argument. You couldn't shame a man into difficult work. You either had him or you didn't. The 11 who remained were the ones worth having. The work settled into a brutal routine over the following days. Morning starts before full light, the canyon walls still dark and cold, the sound of tools on rock and soil echoing in a way that was oddly disorienting. By midday, the temperature climbed into something bearable, and the work picked up speed. By evening, everyone was wrung out and quiet and eating without much conversation around fires that were built for warmth and not sociability. Mara worked the channel clearing alongside the men without making anything of it. She was not the strongest person there, cord was still cord, but she was the most technically precise, the one who understood where the sediment blockages were structural and needed careful removal versus where they could be broken through faster. The men had initially been awkward around her, not hostile exactly, but uncertain in the way of people who hadn't worked alongside a woman in this specific context and weren't sure of the etiquette. That uncertainty dissolved inside of 2 days, because she was simply too focused and too useful for anyone to waste energy on social discomfort. On the 4th day in the canyon, the flash flood came. It announced itself the way flash floods do, not with visible rain, because the storm that caused it was miles above them in the mountains, but with a sound. A low, sustained roar that didn't belong to the wind, coming from up canyon, and a slight but unmistakable change in the smell of the air. Mara heard it first. She couldn't have said exactly how she knew what it was. Some combination of the sound and the smell and something else. Some instinct formed from years of working in country where water could kill you. But she was already shouting before most of the others had registered that anything was wrong. Up! Up the walls! Everyone up the walls now! There was a terrible half-second in which some of the men looked at her with the instinct to question, to ask what was happening before they moved. Garrett did not have that half-second. He trusted her, and he was already moving, and his movement resolved the hesitation in the others. They scrambled. The canyon walls were steep but climbable in most places. Broken rock faces with enough ledge and crack to get 10 feet off the floor, which was all they needed. Garrett got 4 men up before the water came around the upper bend. Not a wave exactly, more like a wall of brown water and debris moving with a force that the canyon's narrow walls converted into something terrifying. It took the floor of the canyon in seconds. Equipment went. 2 of the larger tools, a supply pack, the rope coils they'd left at the base of the clearing site. The water rose to 6 feet and then, over the following 20 minutes, subsided with the same speed it had arrived. When it was gone, the canyon floor was scoured and rearranged. 3 days of careful clearing work had been partially undone. Nobody was hurt. Garrett did the count twice to be sure. But the mood in the aftermath was the specific grim of people looking at something they're going to have to do over again. Cord sat on a ledge above the wet canyon floor and said, to nobody in particular, I hate this canyon. Nobody disagreed with him. Mara was standing on a lower ledge, looking at the damage. Her face was doing the calculation. What was lost? What remained usable? What had to be redone? And in what order? Garrett climbed down to stand beside her. How bad? He said. A 1.5-day setback. Maybe 2. She pointed at the upper section of the channel. The work past the second break is intact. Everything below needs to be redone. She paused. Could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse. She looked at him sideways. How did you know to move so fast? Without asking. He said simply, because you said to. She was quiet for a moment. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of someone absorbing something that landed differently than expected. Not everyone does, she said. I know. She looked back at the canyon floor. Thank you, she said. In that particular way she had, like it cost her something. You warned us, he said. I just had the sense to listen. They climbed down and went back to work. The next 5 days were the hardest stretch. The flood setback had taken the expedition past its original 2-week estimate, and the men who remained were tired in the accumulated way that sleep didn't fully fix. The emotional tenor of the camp shifted, not to despair but to the compressed mechanical determination of people who have decided that they are going to finish a thing and are no longer thinking about whether, only about how. A rock slide on the 7th day buried the upper channel access for 6 hours. Nobody was caught in it, but clearing it cost them half a day, and one of the men took a rock to the forearm that wasn't broken, but was bad enough that he worked slower for the rest of the time. Garrett wrenched his back on the 8th day, moving a large section of debris, and spent 2 evenings after that moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who is not going to admit they're in pain, but isn't doing a very good job of hiding it. Mara noticed and said nothing about it directly, just organized the work assignments the following day so that he was doing less lifting and more directing, in a way that looked like operational logic rather than accommodation. He noticed what she'd done and didn't comment. Some things were better left as what they appeared to be. Young Tom Harlan had a harder time as the days accumulated. He was 14 and strong for his age, but the sustained difficulty of the work and the camp conditions and the simple fact of being away from home longer than he'd expected wore on him in ways he was too proud to say. Mara saw it happening and began doing what she'd done for months back on the Harlan property, giving him tasks that were genuinely difficult but achievable, so that each day ended with something he'd done that mattered. He didn't know she was doing it. It helped anyway. On the morning of the 11th day, they reached the flow control point. It was the crux of the whole plan, the place where the basin water could be directed into the restored channel and guided south through the canyon system toward the valley below. Mara had designed the approach based on the original survey, but the flood and the rock slide had modified the terrain in ways that required her to rethink the final channel opening on the spot. She spent 2 hours doing that thinking, standing at the basin edge with Garrett and Birch, while everyone else rested or made camp, talking through it with a detail and specificity that Birch, who was no amateur at water systems, engaged with seriously, asking good questions, pointing out 2 things she'd missed, both of which she corrected without defensiveness. "Here," she said finally, indicating a natural low point in the rock shelf. "If we open it here and redirect the flow left, you see this angle, the gradient carries it into the upper channel without needing any artificial banking for the first quarter mile. After that, it'll need reinforcing, but we can do that as it flows." Birch looked at it for a long time. "That works," he said. He sounded mildly surprised, which was the highest form of praise available from a man like Birch. "I know it works," she said. They started the opening work that afternoon. It took the better part of a day. Careful work, removing the shelf rock in the right sequence so the water moved where they needed it to, rather than in the path of least resistance, which was never quite the same thing. Garrett worked beside her through most of it, and the men worked around them, and by the evening of the 11th day the channel was open. The water didn't rush. It moved the way water in a new channel always moves, tentatively at first, finding its edges, the flow building as the channel widened and the gradient pulled it forward. They stood back and watched it, all of them, in the fading afternoon light. 11 days of work finding its purpose in this one slow gathering movement of water down through the canyon toward the valley below. Nobody cheered. They were too tired for cheering. Cord sat down heavily on a rock. Birch made a sound that might have been satisfaction. Tom Jr. watched the water with an expression that was too complex for a 14-year-old's face and was also, somehow, exactly right. Garrett stood next to Mara. "How long until it reaches the valley intake?" he asked. 2 days, she said. "Possibly less. Depends on how clear the lower canyon is." "It'll be clear enough." She was watching the water move. Her face was not triumphant. It was the face of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just set it down, and is still in the posture of carrying it. "It worked," he said. "Yeah." She paused. "It worked." He wanted to say more than that. There were several true things available to say about what she had done, about what he felt standing beside her, about the specific nature of the debt the valley below them was going to owe to this moment without knowing it. But he was not a man who said several things when he could say one, and the one thing available to him was honest and enough. "I'm glad you came," he said. She turned to look at him. In the canyon light, tired and trail-worn, the bandage on her left hand now more rust and dust than white, she looked like exactly what she was. Not soft, not polished, not any version of what a woman was supposed to look like in this valley or any other. She looked like someone who had earned every inch of the ground she was standing on. "I know," she said, not dismissively, as a genuine acknowledgement of all of it, of what he meant, of the fact that she was glad too. Let's get these men home. He nodded. The camp came down faster than it had gone up, the way camps always do when the work is done and everyone is ready to be somewhere else. They started down the canyon as the last of the daylight lasted, and the water they had released ran ahead of them in the channel, working its way south, doing what water does when you give it a place to go. The valley was waiting below, dry and frightened, and not yet aware that the worst of it was over. It would know soon enough. The water reached the valley intake on the second day, exactly as Mara had said it would. It arrived without announcement. No one was watching the intake channel when it happened, because the valley was too busy managing its own crisis to stand around waiting for something that most people had only half believed was coming. It was a boy, one of the Calloway children, who saw it first. He came running back to his father's property, shouting about water in the North Channel, and Calloway went out to look, and then Calloway rode to his neighbor, and by mid-morning of that day the word was moving through Blackthorn Ridge, the way only genuinely important news moves, fast, with no exaggeration needed, because the fact itself was enough. Water. In the channel, running clean and steady from the north. Garrett's crew came out of the canyon trail that same morning, travel-worn and quiet. 11 men and 1 woman who had been in the wilderness for nearly 2 weeks and who emerged into the open country above the valley looking like exactly what they were. Nobody came to meet them on the trail. The valley had the water and didn't yet know who to thank for it, and that was fine, because the people who had brought it back were too tired for any kind of reception anyway. They parted ways into the upper pasture, Birch heading east to the Foss property, Cord riding toward the Kane Ranch with the other hands, Tom Jr. turning south toward home with a quietness about him that was different from when he'd left. He had gone into the canyon a boy trying to prove something and come out the other side, just a boy who had done something hard, which was better. Mara rode with him as far as the Harlan Gate. Tom Sr. was in the yard when they arrived, and he looked at his son for a long moment without saying anything, the way fathers look at children who have come back from somewhere that changed them. Then he put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and that was enough. He looked at Mara. "It worked," he said. Not a question. "It worked," she said. He nodded, and something in his face went quiet with relief. "Go sleep," he told her. She almost argued. She could feel the argument forming out of pure habit, the instinct to say she had things to do, that sleep could wait, that the lower channel reinforcement needed checking. But she looked at the Harlan house, at the kitchen window with its ordinary yellow light, and the argument dissolved. "Yeah," she said. "All right." She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, the valley was different. Not visibly different. The drought had not broken overnight. The ground was still hard and the wells were still low, and it was going to take time for the water coming through the restored channel to make its way into the aquifer and back into people's wells. Real recovery was weeks away, probably more. But the mood of the place had shifted in the way moods shift when the worst possibility is taken off the table. People were still worried, still careful, still counting what they had. But the particular quality of panic had drained out of the air, and what was left in its place was something that functioned like resolve. The valley's reaction to what had happened assembled itself over the following days. And it was not simple, because human reactions rarely are. The people who had believed in the plan from the start, Edgar Foss, the Calloway family, the smaller operators who had been most frightened and therefore most willing to trust anything that offered a solution, these people were openly grateful, and their gratitude had the directness of people who understand that they came close to losing everything. Calloway rode to the Kane Ranch personally and stood in Garrett's yard and said, plainly, that he owed the man his operation. Garrett told him equally plainly that the debt was not to him. "The Quinn woman," Calloway said. "Yes." Calloway absorbed this. He had been among the valley's bystanders in the social campaign against Mara. Not an active participant, but not one who had pushed back either. He was an honest enough man to know what that meant. "I'll call on her," he said. "She'd appreciate that," Garrett said. "She won't say so, but she would." The harder part was the rest of it. The people whose relationship to the outcome was more complicated. The operators who had refused to join the expedition and now had water flowing into their channels regardless. The families who had spread the rumor of failure while the crew was still in the canyon. Helena Forsyth, who had walked out of the planning meeting and now benefited from the East Channel restoration without having contributed a single hand or dollar to make it happen. None of these people were punished. Life on the frontier was not organized around punishment. It was organized around survival, and survival required working alongside people you had wronged the same as it required working alongside people you hadn't. The accounting happened in slower, subtler ways. And who was trusted with what the next time something difficult needed doing, in which names people said when they talked about that spring. In the gradual repositioning of social weight that occurs in small communities when a crisis reveals who people actually are. Constance Aldrich came to see Mara on a Thursday morning in the second week of May, and this was the thing nobody expected. Mara was at the Harlan place, working in the kitchen garden, the first planting of the season, taking advantage of the moisture returning to the soil, when she heard the horse and turned to see Constance ride up the lane alone, without her usual presentation of composed elegance, looking like a woman who had spent some time arriving at a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it. Mara set down her trowel and waited. Constance dismounted and stood at the edge of the garden, and for a moment she didn't say anything, which was unusual for a woman who always knew exactly what to say. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. She said it like it tasted bad, which meant it was genuine. Mara looked at her. She had the gray-eyed expression that gave nothing away. "For which part?" Constance's jaw tightened slightly. "For most of it." A silence. A bird moved in the scrub somewhere beyond the fence line. "The word you used," Mara said. Not to be cruel. She said it the way she said everything, because it was the true thing. "Predatory." Constance held her gaze. "Yes, that too." Mara looked at the garden for a moment. She thought about the specific weight of that word and what it had done, how it had traveled, what it had cost her in cold looks and closed doors, and the particular exhaustion of existing in a community that had decided to see the worst version of you. She thought about all the things she could say. "Why did you come?" she asked. Not the apology. She meant the real reason. The thing underneath it. Constance was quiet for a longer moment than expected. "Because my wells came back," she said, "and I knew whose work that was. And I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not someone who can take a thing and pretend I didn't." It was the most honest thing Mara had ever heard Constance Aldrich say, and she recognized it as such. "All right," Mara said. "That's all? What else do you want me to say?" Constance looked at her for a moment with something that might have been frustration, or might have been, at its edges, the beginning of reluctant respect. "You're a difficult woman," she said. "I've been told that before." Constance mounted her horse. She paused before turning it. "He chose well," she said. Not warmly. It cost her too much to say it warmly. But she said it. Then she rode back down the lane without looking back. Mara stood in the garden and watched her go. She thought about what it meant. Not as forgiveness, because one conversation didn't undo what had been done, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But as a data point, as evidence that people could move sometimes, even people who had been certain. She picked up her trowel and went back to work. The Valley meeting happened on the third Saturday of May, and it was Foss who organized it, which was the right choice. Foss had the respect of enough people on both sides of the season's divisions to get them all into the same room. It was held at the Merchants' Hall, which was where the Valley's important things always happened. And it was full in a way that the hall wasn't usually full. People standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. Garrett spoke for about 20 minutes. He covered the winter's water records, the expedition, the channel restoration, the projected timeline for well recovery. He talked about the additional reinforcement work that still needed doing in the lower canyon and who had volunteered for it and what equipment was required. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, without flourish, without performing, just the information clearly delivered. Then he put the map on the table and said, "I want to be specific about where this plan came from." The room was quiet. Mara Quinn identified the problem before anyone else in this valley was willing to call it what it was. She designed the water restoration plan. She surveyed the canyon on the initial expedition. She led the technical work at the basin opening. He paused. "Every well in this valley that has water in it today, that's the direct result of her work. I want that to be clear, and I want it to be on record." He sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Foss started to applaud, and Calloway joined him, and the sound moved through the hall. Not unanimous, not thunderous, because this was a room full of complicated people, and not everyone in it had clean hands regarding how the winter had gone. But it was real. It was the valley, in its imperfect way, correcting its own record. Mara was sitting in the third row between Tom Harlan Sr. and Ellis, and she did not cry. She was not going to cry in the merchant's hall in front of 40 people, but her jaw was set in the specific way of someone who is feeling something they are working very hard to contain. Tom put his hand briefly on her forearm and then took it away because he understood her well enough to know that was exactly the right amount. After the meeting, people came to speak to her. Not all of them. Some left without meeting her eye, and she understood that too because asking people to fully reverse themselves in public was more than most people could manage. But enough. Calloway shook her hand and was clumsy about it, and she appreciated the clumsiness because it was honest. Birch nodded at her in a way that meant something coming from a man who communicated largely in nods. One of the women who had been coldest to her during the winter touched her arm and said simply that she was glad the plan had worked, which wasn't quite an apology, but was a bridge of some kind. She didn't know what to do with any of it, honestly. Being treated with ordinary decency shouldn't have been as disorienting as it was, and the fact that it was disorienting told her something about how long she'd gone without it. It was Garrett who found her afterward, standing outside the hall in the evening air, away from the noise of the dispersing crowd. He stopped beside her. They stood there for a moment, looking at the main street of Blackthorn Ridge, the storefronts, the hitching posts, the last of the spring light on the ridge above. "How are you?" he said. "Strange," she said honestly. Strange how? She thought about how to say it. "I've been the wrong kind of person in this valley since I got here. The wrong name, the wrong clothes, the wrong way of talking, and I got used to that. You get used to the shape of how people see you." She paused. "It's strange when the shape changes, even when it changes towards something better." He was quiet, listening. "I kept waiting for someone to undo it," she said. "Stand up and say, 'No, wait. She's still the girl from nowhere with the worn-out boots. The shape is the shape.'" She looked down at her hands, the calloused palms, the healed scar on her left from the canyon wire. "Nobody stood up." "Nobody's going to," he said. "Not today." She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. "Not today," he agreed. "Not any day if I have anything to say about it." She turned to look at him. He was looking back at her with that direct, unperforming attention of his, the same attention that had crossed a room full of silk-dressed women to find her standing at the edge of it. Not the attention of a man looking at a project or a symbol or something he wanted to save. The attention of a man looking at a person he had recognized. "Garrett," she said. "Yeah." "What are we doing?" He looked at her for a moment. The question sat between them with all its weight. What they'd been. What the valley had made of them. What the winter had cost and given. What came next? "I think you know what I want," he said. "I've been about as clear as a man can be without making a fool of himself." "You have," she said. "I'm asking what we're doing, both of us." He turned to face her fully. He was not a man who knelt for effect or made speeches. But he was also, she had learned over the course of a year, a man who said the real thing when it mattered. "I'd like you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need it, I know you don't need it, but because I think we'd be better together than we'd be apart. And I've been thinking that for about 8 months, and I'm not going to think it any differently in 8 more. He paused. "And because this valley is better with you in it, and I'd like you to stay." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a less certain man might have started talking again to fill the silence. Garrett waited because he had learned how she made decisions. "The ranch needs work on the north fence line," she said. He blinked. "I know it does." "The Harlan property is going to need another set of hands through the summer. Tom's not strong enough yet to manage the cattle work with just the boy." "We can arrange for that." She looked at him. "I'm not going to turn into something easier to live with," she said. "I'm still going to say what I think and work the way I work, and I don't know how to make a house into a performance." "I'm not asking for a performance," he said. "I'm asking for you, the actual you." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. It was the same thing she had said 8 months ago in the North pasture. All right, in that same tone of someone agreeing to something reasonable. But it was different now, and they both knew it, because the months between then and now had been the evidence. Not of perfection, of something more durable than perfection. The evidence of 2 people who had been tested by the same winter and had not broken, separately or together. He didn't reach for her hand. She didn't reach for his. They walked back toward the hall side by side, and there was something between them that did not need to be named to be real. The Valley talked about it, of course. For a week, the wedding announcement was the subject of every kitchen conversation in Blackthorn Ridge, and the opinions expressed were about what you'd expect from a community that had spent a year making up its mind about Mara Quinn and now had to live with the fact that Garrett Kane had made up his differently. Most of the opinions landed somewhere between genuine warmth and grudging acceptance. A few were neither. Mara did not follow those conversations closely. She had stopped following them sometime in the canyon when she had been too busy staying alive to care much what anyone was saying back in the valley. The wedding was small. Garrett had not wanted a spectacle, and Mara would have been miserable in one, so what they had instead was a gathering of the people who had actually mattered through the hard year. The Harlans, Ellis, Foss, Calloway, and his family, Birch, Cord, who cleaned up better than anyone expected, and a few others. It was held on the Kane Ranch on a Saturday morning in June when the weather was finally warm and the north pastures were beginning to green up from the returned water. Tom Harlan Jr., who had developed an attachment to being present at significant moments, stood in the back with his hat in his hands and looked like he might burst from the effort of not showing how moved he was. Mara wore her better dress, not gray-blue this time, but a deep rust color that she'd bought with her own wages, because it was her wedding, and she was going to have something that was hers. Her hair was down, which it almost never was, and Garrett looked at her when she came to stand beside him with the expression of a man who has been sure of a thing for a long time and is still somehow surprised by it. The ceremony was short. They were not people who needed a great many words for the things that mattered. When it was done, Tom Harlan Sr. poured whiskey for everyone who wanted it, and Cord somehow found a fiddle. And for a few hours, the Kane Ranch was full of the specific kind of noise that comes when people who have been through something hard are finally on the other side of it. Not celebrating victory exactly, but celebrating survival, which is the more honest thing. Mara stood at the edge of it for a while watching, the way she had always watched, from the sides of rooms, taking it in. Then Ellis came to stand beside her with 2 tin cups and handed her one without preamble. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You know what I heard someone say today?" He looked out at the gathering. "I heard Pullman tell his wife that Garrett Kane married the smartest woman in the valley." She looked at him. "Pullman. The very same." Ellis sipped his whiskey. "People do move sometimes." She looked back at the gathering, at Tom Jr. laughing at something Cord had said, at Foss and Calloway talking with the ease of men who had been through the same fire and knew it, at Garrett across the yard, who caught her looking and held it for a moment before someone came to speak to him. "Yeah," she said, "they do." She drank her whiskey. There was no version of what happened afterward that was clean or uncomplicated, because there never is. The Lower Canyon reinforcement work took another month and cost more than projected and caused 2 arguments between valley operators about who owed what share. The Harlan operation made it through the summer, but barely, and it was Mara who spent 3 evenings in August helping Tom work through the numbers and find the path that kept them solvent. The Kane Ranch's north fence did need significant work, and it fell to her and Ellis to manage most of it through September, while Garrett dealt with a cattle dispute with a neighbor to the east that turned unpleasant before it resolved. Real life did not arrange itself into a shape that had a moral at the end of it. It was just the ongoing thing. Hard seasons and easier ones, problems that got solved and problems that didn't. The slow work of building something that was worth the building. What Mara understood, by the end of that year, was something she'd probably always known, but had only now seen proven. That the frontier did not care about your name or your clothes or what the women in Constance Aldrich's parlor thought of you. It cared about what you did when things went wrong. It cared whether you showed up with lumber in a snowstorm and whether you could read the sound of water in a canyon before it arrived, and whether, when a valley needed saving, you had already thought through the way to save it. She had always had those things. The valley had just needed long enough to run out of other options before it was willing to see them. She did not forgive the winter's cruelties easily, because she was not built for easy forgiveness, and she understood that pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. But she also understood that the people who had been hardest on her had been operating from the same fear that drove most human meanness. The fear of what it meant if someone like her was worth something, if the things they'd built their sense of themselves on turned out to matter less than they'd believed. That was not a simple thing to have taken away from you. She knew that better than most. The calloused hands remained. They would always remain. She had not stopped being who she was and had no interest in starting. But what they meant in the valley's accounting had changed, and that change was permanent, built from something more durable than reputation or rumor. It was built from 11 days in a canyon and 40 feet of channel work and water that ran downhill toward people who needed it. It was built from this fact that she had done the thing, and the thing had worked, and the valley remembered. On a clear evening in October, one year, almost to the day, since she had stood at a November fence line and told Garrett Kane about the wrong snowpack on the mountain. She stood at the north edge of the Kane Ranch and looked out at the valley below. The water table was recovering. The cattle were fat from a good summer. The light was going gold across the ridge the way it did in autumn, the kind of light that made everything look briefly like it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Garrett came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, because he was a man who understood when nothing needed saying. They stood there for a while, the two of them, in the specific silence of people who have built something together and know what it cost. The valley spread below them, imperfect and ongoing, full of people who were doing their best with what they had and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not, which was the same thing it had always been and would always be. It was enough. More than enough. It was home.